I wonder how I went from football hooligans to food. Um, Actually, I mean, I've always been interested in food. I like cooking. I'm, I'm from Louisiana. There's certainly a French connection there, but I got really engaged by food when I lived in England. And I lived in England about 20 years, and it was mainly the proximity to France and the respect for the dinner party and maybe a certain performance element of making dinner that characterized some of my friends, and a longing to work in a kitchen to know a chef's command of ingredients and especially the seasons. I love the idea of seeing chefs go to a market and standing in front of whatever it was, an eggplant, and knowing that there were 30 things that he or she could do with that eggplant tonight, and then moving to the next stand, and there's that same knowledge would inspire him or her to do something else. I ended up writing about it, though, a little bit by accident. I happened to have a chef over for dinner, Mario Batali, a man of some renown, and he distinguished himself as just one of the most hilarious, rule-breaking, rude, funny, gifted, smart, quick-witted people I'd met. And the following week, I was attending an editorial meeting at the New Yorker, where I was then the fiction editor, and it was an ideas meeting. I said, somebody's got to write about this guy. I mean, it's a natural profile. And I proposed the writer Jay McInerney, who is good with food and writes about wine, and the editor of the New Yorker, David Remnick, who'd been to our apartment for dinner and therefore saw that I was probably one of the only two professional New Yorkers who cooked, said that I should write it. And I didn't want to write it because I didn't want to do a celebrity profile, but I loved the idea that I could use it as an excuse, as a way to get into the kitchen. So it just opened up this whole thing that I've been wanting to do for forever. And I loved it. I loved it from the first day I stepped in. I loved its intensity, its comprehensiveness, its the fact that you were cut off from the rest of the world. It was rough. It was nasty. There were abuses of kinds that weren't anything like what I would see later in France, but it was just this whole world. I really found in the end, this little idea that I had for a profile for somebody was like the beginning of a great adventure, and really, really an exciting one. It just the whole world became different after that first day in the kitchen. After I'd done my apprenticeship at Babbo, I wrote a piece for the New Yorker, and then I went back, and I was there another 6 months. I realized that if you're going to learn Italian food, you don't learn it from the people who are doing Italian food or not in Italy or not Italian. And my wife and I had once met Dario Cecchini by chance, passing through Penzano on our way to someplace else. Actually, yeah, it was right after the 9/11 terror, which happened while we were away. And he was always fixed in my mind as somebody I wanted to follow up on. And what I was looking for someone to work for in Italy, I had been studying Italian. My wife speaks fluent Italian. I learned a few phrases, and I phoned him and said who I was in Italian, and that I wanted to be his slave. I remember I had to, get that right, and that we were, ready to come over and basically abase ourselves to and be his disciples. And he said, come now, and it was like I knew what it was. It was like a week later, we were in Italy, and then it all changed yet again. French cuisine, in many respects, was like the next thing to do once you feel like you've mastered to an extent some of the kitchen of Italy. I'm not going to immodestly call myself a master of any of it, but certainly a serious student. But there was a provoking thing that really intrigued me, which is that more and more I kept hearing when I was in Italy that the Italians, and specifically Caterina de' Medici, had invented invented French cooking. And the first time I heard this, I thought, but they were serious. And I kind of ignored it. But then it was a big theme for Dario, and he would list all the food that came from France, from Italy, that are now French. You know, duck d'orange and just this, that, and the, shallots and artichokes. And it was so persuasive, and people were so passionate about it that it got me to reading about the Italian Renaissance, about the cooking in the Italian Renaissance. By then, I was pretty good reading Italian, and the books that are written in the Italian Renaissance about the kitchen were fantastic. They're so ambitious. You know, it's not the Italian food that we think of now. It's not pasta and bread. It was very elaborate dishes, very elaborate sauces. One of my favorites is a way of preparing beef in which you basically bone the entire animal and then refill it without bones with all these different preparations, and then serve the cow for dinner to your 500 guests, and then cut the animal up in slices. This is eccentric. This is like way out. And I thought there might be something to this. And at the end of Heat, I kind of throw it down as a declaration that would come to haunt me to an extent, which is that after Italy, I needed to follow the path of Caterina de' Medici and see if the Italians did teach the French how to cook, and if so, what did they teach them? So it was always there when Heat was done. It was my declaration that I was going to do it, and it took me quite a while before I ever did. So I remember my wife and I were celebrating a wedding anniversary where actually a lot of things in our life at that moment were going wrong, even if two of those things that were going wrong were actually sources of great pleasure, namely the arrival of twin boys named George and Frederick. But what she really wanted was me to stop writing endlessly long New Yorker pieces that I researched for months and months, and get right, start write. You said you're going to write a French book. Write the book you're going to write. But I didn't know how to go to France. France seemed very far away. If you're in England, France is quite close, but you're in New York. I didn't have context. I didn't know the language. French chefs seem so, everyone knows what French chefs in their pictures. I just look at they're always got their arms crossed, which is like say, don't even think about approaching me. I'm self-sufficient. I'm a tough guy, and I don't need you. And it's usually a guy. And I didn't know how to do it. And then we were waiting to get on the train, and then this round man, smelling quite a bit of wine and maybe quite a bit of sweat, was poised to jump in front of the queue, just in front of my wife. I recognized him. Wasn't sure how I recognized him, but I recognized him, and I stepped in his way. He didn't see me step in his way. We collided. We ended up embracing each other so close that we could kiss, and then he ran off. And then I saw him later on the train, and I realized, well, after much inference and embarrassing explorations, that this was Michel Richard, and he was not buttoned up. He didn't have his arms crossed. He was very welcoming. He was very accessible. He was wildly imaginative. He was everything I didn't believe a French chef to be. Really liked him. And really what he was, and he'd be horrified to be described thus, he was actually quite Italian. He was very welcoming. He also had a beautiful, imaginative mind. And I thought, this isn't really what I need, but this is the person I want to hang out with, and he will be my introduction. And he was. Daniel Boulud was another one of my American-French friends, not so much at the beginning. Actually, if I'd met Danielle properly early on, I probably would have been working with Danielle from the very beginning, but I don't regret for a minute the time I spent with Michel Richard. The Danielle I got to know was the Danielle who was born and raised just outside of Lyon. And that Danielle is just an angelic, dreamy, passionate, tender creature. And very different from the person you see at his very expensive, very beautiful restaurant. Some of the greatest cooking I've ever had in my life. But it's a different persona there. And the persona I met there was wonderful. And he became, he was kind of like a touchstone. He would come to Lyon always to see his family. He would come quite often. We would always see him. Our boys who didn't have a grandfather regarded his father as, called him Papi Belou, as if he were their grandfather. And it was it was and is and continues to be a very, very intimate, rewarding relationship. Many people have asked me about why to call it dirt. And it's mainly because when I went to France, one of the things I wanted to get was I wanted to understand French cooking. I wanted basics. I wanted to know French flavors. I wanted to know what a good baguette tastes like. I wanted to know what a sauce béarnaise really should look like. I wanted to know what a good roast chicken should look like. I wanted to know these really primary things. And it was really what I was wanting was like getting down to basics. But the more I get down to the basics, I realized that the heart of most French cooking really is in what it makes, what it produces, not just fruits and vegetables, but also the cheese and the wine and the fruits and the bread and the things that are made with these fruits and vegetables, cows, and that seemed to come down more and more something really basic, really, really basic, which was dirt. And it's not dirt like terroir necessarily, but it's just like they all have a kind of expression. Like there's 2,000 plus cheeses in France. And I love the fact that there are 2,000 cheeses. And they go back to a time when this is what was made to get you through the winter. And they're all different. And their difference expresses the animals that they have, what the animals eat, what the weather was like, and a unique sense of place. And I love the fact that they preserve them. There's this many different cheeses. The only country that even comes close to the French, ironically, are the Italians. And they're similarly kind of maniacs about place. And the word that expressed that for me was dirt. I mean, in the end, it becomes a very big word for one of the big discoveries of the book. But it expressed France for me. I think at the heart of American ingenuity, and I think there is such a thing as American ingenuity, is a preparedness to go where others wouldn't go and do, therefore, what others wouldn't do. You could say the concept of American ingenuity arises from the very foundation of North America, this place that people, I'm always astonished when I read back what people did, where they picked up and left usually Britain, place where I lived for almost 20 years, and crossed the Atlantic to who knows what. That's, people say, flatter me that I went on this big adventure. I went to Lyon. I went with a family. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know anybody there. I had no friends there. I didn't know the language. I didn't have any real introductions. And all that's true. And it wasn't easy, but it's nothing compared to what everybody did to come here. And especially when you see cultures that, the appeal of an Italian culture, a French culture, a Chinese culture, Japanese cultures, these are deep, deep historic cultures. And their beauty is their historical depth. What you often find there, though, is an inhibition that comes from that. And I think at the heart of American ingenuity is get up and do it. And to the extent that my writing or even my life has been an example of that, is that there have been many times in my life when things were going really well, and I just got up and did something else, and it really wasn't easy. I got up and I went to England and ended up staying in England. And then when everything was going really, really well, I got up and went back to the United States. And when things were going really well there, I was the fiction editor of the New Yorker. I got up and ended up throwing myself into Europe, and then later throwing myself into France might have been like the biggest, craziest venture of them all, because we had these twin boys, George and Frederick. We knew really only a few people. And there was my commitment that, I wasn't going to do a tourist book about French cooking. I really wanted to find out what makes French cooking. I really wanted to go deep and master this thing. And there was no way that was going to be easy. And it wasn't.